My name is Brett Christophers. I'm an Englishman living in Sweden. I'm a university teacher and researcher at Uppsala University in Sweden. I've been in Sweden for 10 years now, and I work in a geography department as a human geographer. A lot of the research I've been doing in the past 5 years or so has been to do with land ownership, also looking at the recent history of changes in land ownership, specifically in Britain. So the original enclosures was not really one event. It was a long, drawn-out set of processes, beginning really many centuries ago, but really concentrated in the period from the mid-18th century until the end of the 19th century. Across Britain was a set of processes whereby Britain's commoners, the mass of the population, lost their rights to use and access common land. So common land wasn't land that was owned publicly or in common. It was typically privately owned, but people that didn't own the land had these common rights to access and use the land for, pasture and picking berries or whatever else it might have been, and therefore to sustain themselves. And through the enclosure movement, those lands, those common lands, were enclosed, literally, through putting up hedgerows and stuff like that. What that meant was that millions of people who had been accustomed to sustaining themselves through their relationships with this land could no longer do so. The reason it was such an important period in English history and British history was that not only did millions of people lose their ability to sustain themselves, to maintain their traditional livelihoods, but it was fundamental to the birth of industrial capitalism, because those newly landless people became, in moving to the cities, they became the new industrial workforce that was essential really for the birth and growth of industrial capitalism. They became the new waged labour because they had to find another way of sustaining themselves. So the enclosure movement was really central to the change in Britain from a feudal society to a capitalist society between the mid-18th century and late 19th century, as I say. So it was a pivotal period in British history, and something like a third to a half of the whole of Britain underwent this process of enclosure. So it was really, really fundamental to what happened in terms of the historical transformation of Britain in that period.
Now, we can see on our maps here in Britain, if you open up an Ordnance Survey map, quite often it will say there's the site of a medieval village, so that would be one that was enclosed. In other words, the houses were torn down, the stone used maybe for building walls, fences, new structures to keep people out of the newly privatised land. But your book is about the new enclosures. You're saying that this process is very much alive still today.
What I'm trying to refer to in the book, it's a different set of processes, but what I'm trying to argue, and this is why I use the term, is that although it's a different set of processes, what I'm suggesting is that although it definitely hasn't happened on the same scale, it potentially has a similar set of consequences. So what the new enclosure is another form of land privatisation. So if the original enclosure was essentially the privatisation of rights to access and use the land rather than ownership, the new enclosure is literally the privatisation of ownership. So what it involves is the sale of publicly owned land to the private sector. So this is land that was owned by one or other public body, which can be a central government department, for example, the Health Service. It could be the Department of Food and Rural Affairs, DEFRA. It could be the Ministry of Defence, or it could be, in many cases, a local authority, so a district council or a city council. And what's happened over the last 40 years, really since the beginning of the 1980s, is that public bodies across the length and breadth of Britain have come under increased pressure from a central government, so from Whitehall, essentially, so from the Prime Minister's office, from the Treasury, from the Cabinet Office, to dispose of their land, to privatise their land, and in doing so, hand it over to the private sector. And so that's what the new enclosure is about.
Okay, now, just to put Bristol into context here, in the 1990s, I can remember reading somewhere that Bristol, as a proportion of the land area that's controlled by the local authority, Bristol City Council, had the largest proportion of land owned by the City Council of any other local authority in the country. And it's quite clear, you're right, they are divesting themselves of this land, they are selling it off. Can you actually quantify across the country the extent to which this is happening? Now, that's obviously not the easiest thing to do, Brett, but it's extremely useful if we can see how much land has been privatised in the last 40 years.
Yeah, so that's one of the things I tried to do in the book, and I think we can do it, although it takes a bit of piecing together. So the way you can't do it is by saying, okay, I'm going to look at every single land transaction that's taken place and figure out how much land's been sold in each case and then kind of tot it all up. And you can't do that for a number of reasons. One is that there's just been so many individual sales, literally tens of thousands, maybe even as many as 100,000. So first of all, it would just be a daunting process. And second of all, the information would not in many cases be made available. And thirdly, the information is literally doesn't exist. So it's fairly clear that many public bodies, until quite recently, actually just haven't kept records of what's been sold, how much it's been sold for, who it's been sold to, and so on and so forth. So you literally couldn't do that. What you can do, though, is say, okay, we're going to look at the question of how much land the state, so the government, local and national, owned when this process began at the end of the 1970s. And we're going to look at how much land the state owns today, and then we'll extrapolate between the two. And so that's what I did. And in the late 1970s, some research was done that indicated that at that time, in total, the state owned about 20% of the land across Britain, whereas today, the state owns roughly about half that amount. So we're talking about going from about 4 million hectares of publicly owned land to roughly just over 2 million hectares of publicly owned land. So roughly an area about 10% of Britain by area has been sold off. And one thing that's and we can say a bit more about where that land has come from. So roughly about 20% of that, so about 400,000 hectares, was actually land that was not sold as land. It was land that was owned by public enterprises that were privatised, and it was privatised along with them. So I'm talking about the water companies, the electricity companies like National Grid, the National Coal Board, and so on and so forth. So about 400,000 hectares disappeared into private ownership with the utilities. And then of the rest, a lot's come from the Forestry Commission, a lot's come from the Ministry of Defence, and a lot has come from local authorities. So the numbers I've got anyway suggest that probably local authorities have been hardest hit, and that something like 60% of the land that local authorities cumulatively owned at the end of the 1970s has been privatised in the period since then. And you're quite right to say that the proportions that were owned in different parts of the country varied quite a lot. In some cities, the local authorities owned a lot of land, and in some they owned less land. And getting down to a more granular level would be very, very difficult and take a lot of research. But overall, about 60% of local authority land has gone to the private sector.
Weston, Supermare and Filton, both airfields which most people driving around the southwest, around the Bristol area will know, are now being built all over with housing. To what extent is this actually coming back to the... what I'm trying to say here is, how much value for money has the Ministry of Defence got, or British Aerospace in the case of Filton Airfield? Do we know how much value for money they've got by selling off this land?
Well, again, it's a really difficult question to answer. I mean, there's a few things I can say in response to that. The first thing to say is that this is one thing that the government, local and national, can't really be criticised for, but a lot of this land that was sold maybe 10, 20, 30, even 40 years ago was sold just on the cusp of Britain entering a period of unprecedented inflation in land prices, in land values. So the kind of the reality is that the state didn't secure value for money in many cases because it sold it, and then all of a sudden land prices shot up, and obviously those land value gains have been realised by the private sector. I think a second thing you can say, if you look through the historical record, and I think this is a really important point, is that another reason that value for money was not secured for taxpayers is that very often land was sold in situations of, well, actual or effective compulsion. So the public body was under such pressure to sell from central government. And as any one who knows anything about land markets will tell you, you don't tend to secure market value for a piece of land if you're selling under conditions of compulsion, because the market can smell out a forced buyer that's entering some kind of fire sale. So I think it's pretty clear that in many cases value for money was not secured, and there's plenty of specific examples where exactly that's happened, which I talk about in many cases in the book. So, sure, in some cases, market value would have been secured. In many others not. But even where it was, it was sold before, land prices really shot up. And so, if you look at the value of the land that was privatised today, that land is worth vastly more in most cases today than it was when the government sold it off.
Well, what about the National Health Service? You mentioned the NHS there. Have they been selling off? Because as far as I know, most of the hospitals that were there 10 years ago are still there. They haven't been sold off, have they?
So the NHS is a tricky one, obviously, because of the structural transformation that's gone on in the health service over that long period. So when this period began, so around the late 1970s, the best information I've seen is that the health service in its totality owned around about 50,000 acres, which I'm just trying to do my maths. It's just over 20,000 hectares. And I think today the health service in its totality owns about 6,000 hectares. So about 70% of the land that was owned by the health service at the beginning of the period has been sold off. So yeah, health service land has been ravaged actually, and it's still being sold off today.
So that's actual hospital sites going, or is it grounds of hospitals? What's being sold off? Do we know?
It's both. I mean, it's definitely both, and a lot of this is to do, is actually quite understandable. One of the big this is definitely not my area of expertise because it's not talking about land per se, but obviously the move away from long-term institutional care for people that were, chronically ill, either mentally or physically, towards care in the community, meant that there was a massive deinstitutionalization of the health service, particularly in the 1980s, and that saw a lot of land and property being freed up and sold off. But across the public sector as a whole, there's been a push to as the word that's used being to rationalise the estate and to cram employees and services into ever smaller areas in an efficiency drive, and that's kind of freed up this excess of surplus property to be sold off.
So this is the other end of the coin, I suppose, the other side of the coin. Who bought this land? Who's been buying all this land?
I mean, that's obviously a difficult question to answer as well, because of the fact that the record keeping has been so poor. What we can see from the records is that let's split this into two issues. There's housing land on the one hand, so land that was basically sold off with housing under the right to buy program, which was obviously bought by the tenants of those properties. But leaving aside housing land and thinking about all other land that's been sold, it's been primarily property companies that have been buying it, but also financial institutions. So when I'm talking about property companies, I'm talking about companies like Land Securities Group and British Land, but also property developers like Berkeley Group, like Taylor Wimpey, like Persimmon. And then also financial institutions like Legal & General and Aviva are massive landowners today, but also retailers, for example, Tesco and so on. So there's a wide swathe of companies that have been involved in buying this land. But particularly, I would say that over the last decade or so, it's been heavily concentrated on property developers, precisely because the main reason that the government has really been pushing this, particularly over the last 7 or 8 years, is the rationale being to enable the construction of more housing in the face of Britain's housing crisis. So that's been the rationale that's been given, is we need to sell off this surplus public land to free up land that the property sector needs in order to build the housing that Britain needs.
Brett, what can we do about this?
Well, the first question, before asking that question, I think the question that's worth asking first of all is, why would one want to do anything about this? Is this something that is per se, on balance, a bad thing or a good thing? My own conclusion in the book is that it's on balance definitely a bad thing. I think that, partly because of what the public sector loses, but also partly because of what the private sector has tended to do with the land that has been handed over. I think there's very limited evidence of good things coming of privatisation and plenty of evidence of bad things coming of it. I think that one of the big problems is that the private sector tends to do things with any of its assets, whether it's land or anything else, things that are profitable. And there are a whole series of things that we as a society need from land that the private sector typically doesn't deliver, because it's not in its interest to do so. And examples of things like that would be genuinely affordable housing. If land is being handed over to the private sector, it's in the private sector's interest to use that land in a way that maximises profits. That's what the private sector does. And I think that through selling the land, the state has gradually but consistently lost the ability to continue to do certain things with the land that it's only really the public sector that does. And I think one of the really striking things now is that in the last year or two we've heard more and more talk about local authorities returning to building social housing at scale for the first time in a generation. But now they're thinking about doing that, they're actually realising that in many cases they no longer have the land that they need to do it because it's been sold off. And there are many other examples as well. Things like providing allotments, for example, local councils. There's enormous queues nationwide because the land's all been sold off. So I think on balance it has been a negative development, and I think the fact that it's ongoing is a bad thing. And I think that it should be stopped. But I think the key thing I would say is that the impetus to do that has to come from central government. So I have a huge amount of sympathy for local authorities who, have seen their grants from central government slashed by 50, 60% or more in the last decade. They're desperate to continue to provide the services that they're charged with providing, and they have less income from central government to do that. And that puts the finances of local authorities under enormous pressure. And I think under those conditions, it's almost natural for local authorities to try to liquidate whatever assets they can in order to stay afloat financially. So I think the impetus has to come from central government, and the central government has a responsibility, I think, to enable public bodies to be in a position where they don't feel compelled to continue to sell off their assets, and that they will be able to use them in ways that are socially beneficial. And I think right now, across the public sector, lots of land-owning public bodies do not feel capable of behaving in a way with their land that provides the social benefits that people expect them to provide.
Are there any legal techniques or approaches that people can use to keep access to public land? Because what we're seeing increasing pressure is for local authorities to either lease that land out, which may have been park land, that sort of thing. Are there any ways to hang on to it and keep it available for public use?
Well, certain public bodies, including local authorities, when they sell land, they're under an obligation to provide notice of their intention to do so. For example, in local media, people can register their view on that. But as far as I know, the local authorities, they're obliged to listen, but they're not obliged to actually act on what people say. So if people locally say, no, we don't want you to sell the land, the local authority, I think, is well within its rights to say, well, we'll listen to you, but we're going to go ahead and do it anyway.
What can people do in that situation? Because surely, I mean, some of these bits of land, say for example, they're the green lungs of the city. It may be that there simply are no other, say, public parks or places to walk the dog or whatever within walking distance or within any kind of reach. Is it actually legal for a local authority to say, well, actually, we don't have to provide you with any parks? I'm sorry, we're going to be building on this one.
It's a good, that is a good question. I don't know the answer to that question. But I've never come across anything that suggests that that there are constraints on local authorities' ability in terms of how far they can go with the process. I don't know the answer to that question as to whether they actually have to provide space or land, for want of a better word, for up to for certain things, like, for example, public parks, and parks absolutely are one of the types of public space that are under immense pressure and are being sold off quite a lot across the country at the moment. I mean, one of the things that a lot of groups are trying to do across the country is to say to local authorities, look, if you really do want to sell this land, then sell it to us. We'll put together a bid as a community group to buy the land instead of you selling it off to a property developer. But the problem there is that if it comes to a competition on price between a community group and a property developer with deep pockets, then it's pretty obvious who's going to win. And as I said earlier, if you're the chief executive or the chief financial officer of a local authority trying to balance your budget, then it's pretty difficult to imagine that they're going to say, okay, we'll accept the significantly lower bid. Even if on principle they might prefer to do so, in practice it's very difficult for them to do that. The book is called The New Enclosure, and the subtitle is the Appropriation of Public Land in Neoliberal Britain. It's published by Verso. I believe it's available in for example, in local Waterstones, but it's also obviously available on the web. In fact, I think probably the cheapest place to get it is from Verso's own website.
Brett Christophers, thanks very much for joining us.
You're welcome.
That was Brett Christophers talking to me from Sweden, author of The New Enclosures, the Appropriation of Public Land in Neoliberal Britain.
You're listening to dialectradio.co.uk, your local community radio run by volunteers. Log on to our website at dialectradio.co.uk to find out more.